I'm Charlene Collins Freeman. Thanks for joining me for this watercolor tutorial painting this lovely couple of eastern yellow robins from Australia. For this painting, I will use the following supplies: Arches cold press watercolor paper, 140 pound. I'm painting on a 9 by 12. A pencil, an F pencil or lighter is best, and an eraser. Watercolor brushes. I'm using 3 rounds. They are the Princeton Heritage Series 4050, size 2, 6, and 16. All my watercolor paints are Daniel Smith paints, and I'm using Hansa Yellow Light, Quinacridone Gold, Aussie Red Gold, Quinacridone Rose, Burnt Sienna, Indigo, French Ultramarine Blue, Manganese Blue Hue, Sap Green, and Green Gold. However, I want to encourage you to use whatever colors you prefer. Don't get hung up on having my same exact palette. You'll also need water and a water container and paper towels. My reference photo is from Pixabay. Pixabay.com is a great resource for artists. Most photos on this website are copyright free and attribution free. This particular photo was taken by photographer Kandal Kishavala from India. This is my line drawing from the photograph. My line drawing is fairly detailed, even though I want to create a fairly loose watercolor of this image. I just find that by having a detailed foundation, it's easier to be loose and spontaneous while I'm painting and not worry about the accuracy of the drawing once the paint starts flying. I start off with Manganese Blue Hue and Quinacridone Rose. I'm painting the very first watery layer on the white flowers. I want to have my background be white as well, so I can't just leave the flowers as the white of the paper. I'll be adding a bit of color to them using these watery washes. I'm letting the Manganese Blue Hue and the Quinacridone Rose blend together on the paper. I am paying attention to my reference photo. My drawing is a guideline for me, but I don't necessarily want to paint just within the lines, especially on the flowers. I want a loose look to these, so I let the paint splash slightly outside of my pencil lines here and there. You'll notice that I didn't mix my Manganese Blue Hue and my Quinacridone Rose together on my palette. That would give me a homogeneous purpley hue, but I really wanted each petal to be slightly different. So occasionally I dip my brush into the blue, then into the pink. I let each mix be a little bit different than the previous mixes. I want these flowers to all look a little bit different from each other. So don't be concerned about mixing a big batch of purple together on your palette before you begin painting, but rather keep those colors separate and paint by dipping your brush into one petal, then the other. Sometimes I don't even rinse out between dipping my brush so that I'm getting a big variety of colors with these two hues. Then I come in with Hansa Yellow Light, and I start adding some of the yellow spots of color I see down the branch. In some areas, my yellow paint will blend into the Manganese Blue Hue and the Quinacridone Rose I painted earlier. It's not dry everywhere, and that's okay. I want these flowers to be very soft, and letting the colors blend only helps add to that effect. I work my way down the branch, painting in these yellow spots of color I see. Everything is still quite watery and light. We'll come in later and do a second pass to add more dimension and color to these areas. I find that whispering my way into a painting, this is really a gentle way to tiptoe into it, makes the whole process easier and less intimidating, rather than starting with dark, bold colors right from the start. It's time to let those flowers dry and turn our attention to the birds. I start off with more watery manganese blue hue. I paint the entire eye and top beak. Later we'll come in and add the dark colors we see. This manganese blue hue will really just be the highlights in those areas. I find it easier to paint the whole shape with this light color rather than just trying to paint in a little stroke of a highlight. I mix up two separate puddles yet again, this time green gold and sap green. And I start touching in areas where I see these spots of green along the branch. Try to use your entire brush for these brush strokes. Don't use your brush as a pen where you're drawing a leaf and then coloring it in, but rather press down the whole brush onto your paper so that the brush itself can make these organic shapes that read as leaves. Again, vary where your brush gets its paint. Sometimes dip it into the green gold puddle, sometimes into the sap green puddle. You can see on my palette that the two puddles are starting to mix together. But on the top, there's really still quite a bit of strong sap green, and at the bottom, the green gold. I've been using my number 6 round brush for these strokes, which is the medium-sized brush. For the details, I'll button down to the smaller brush. With those spots of green in place, I'm going to turn my attention back to the bird. I start off with quinacridone gold. I'm still using my middle-sized brush, my number 6. And my quinacridone gold now is a thicker consistency than the paint I was using for the flowers. I would say it has more the consistency of milk than it does of water. For that light splash of gold that I see on the throat of the bird, I use the quinacridone gold. But coming down to where it gets a little redder, I add Aussie red gold. Right now this looks entirely too bright, but keep a couple of things in mind. One is that watercolors fade as they dry. And two, we will be coming in and doing a second pass with burnt sienna, which will help tone down these areas. Here I'm adding the burnt sienna while my other colors are still damp, so that they can diffuse softly together. I'm careful to paint around those white petals, because at the same time that I'm painting the bird's breast, I'm also outlining those flowers. And the tail part is even darker, so I've added more burnt sienna to my mix. And that mixes the quin gold and the Aussie red gold with burnt sienna in it. I rinse out my brush, and then when you see my brush go off camera, it's because I'm tapping it on my towel to get out any excess water. As I let those colors blend together, I also lift some color out. I leave it in my brush and use it for the lighter areas on the bird's throat. Because I'm painting while this entire shape is damp, There's a real softness between one color and the other. I'm not getting any hard edges. You would get hard edges if your paint is dry before you've had a chance to lay down the color next to it. And if that's the case, it means you're either painting too slowly or your paint is not watery enough when you paint with it, and it dries almost immediately on your paper. Having a nice watery mix of paint with the consistency of milk really allows you to drop colors next to each other and get the soft blends that will define the softness of this subject, in this case, the bird. Again, on the second bird, I started off with quinacridone gold on his throat and Aussie red gold towards the bottom of his belly. I soften these edges before the paint has a chance to dry. To soften the edges, I use a barely damp brush. I dip my brush into the water, I tap out the excess water on my towel, and then I use the tip of that brush to soften edges. There's also a very subtle bit of this orangey color along the edges of these feathers. So I start to paint them in. They look pretty awkward right now, but they'll diffuse softly into the dark colors of the feathers that we will come in and do in just a little while. I need to give myself this orangey mix right now, and I'm definitely adding more detail than I will leave in at the end. It's easier to have these markings there and then paint over them if I decide that I don't need them, as opposed to trying to come in and paint them later when all the darks are in. With those markings in place, I put down my medium brush and I pick up my small. It's a number 2 brush and it's perfect for these kinds of details. I really only paint the details with these small brushes. Trying to paint bigger shapes with these small brushes will end up giving me hard edges for sure. For these little spots of a darker orangey red, I've mixed quinacridone rose into my Aussie red gold. And it's a fairly thick consistency, I would say milky to creamy even. I'm paying attention to where these dots actually show up in the reference photo because they really help give us a sense of orientation and of dimension of the flowers. As I finish putting in these dots, I noticed that on one of the flowers, I miscalculated how dry the flower was, and my red dots are starting to spread throughout most of the petal of that flower. So here you see me just touch it gently with my towel and soak up that paint that was spreading. By pressing my towel into that area, I also helped dry it. So I quickly was able to paint in those red dots and put down my detail brush and pick up my middle brush again. I'm making a nice puddle of burnt sienna, and it's fairly thick. I would say at least the consistency of milk. I touch into it a little bit of indigo, and I'm ready to start painting the darker accents on the wings. Notice I'm using the entire brush to paint some of these feathers. Again, this is what I was talking about earlier with the leaves too. Don't just use your brush as a pencil to draw your shapes, but use the whole brush to also paint different strokes. By pressing down my brush, I'm able to paint an entire feather stroke, and it gives it a nice organic look as opposed to trying to draw around everything and then paint it in. Here I'm painting around some of those orange markings that I painted earlier. For now I'm being careful, and later I'll come in and paint a little bit more smudgy around those areas to give it a more spontaneous look. But initially, I want to be careful with the structure of these wings. On my brush, I have burnt sienna and indigo. And here you see me add a little bit more indigo into my mix to get that dark shoulder. And here I start scuffing up some of those lines of those orange markings. I don't really need them to be that crisp and that obvious. I pick up French ultramarine blue, fairly watery consistency, add some of my mixture of burnt sienna and indigo to it, and use that to paint the lighter areas of brown on the wing, the shoulder, the back of the bird, and the bird's head. I found that adding French ultramarine blue to my mix of burnt sienna and indigo gives it a lovely hue, perfect for these areas. And I'm painting quite a bit more watery than I painted the darker parts of the wing. Here I'm using the paint that's already in my painting and a slightly damp brush to warm up that back of the first bird. You can see that the orange I painted earlier is showing through, but I've glazed it with a really light layer of a watery mix of brown. I'm doing a similar application to the belly of this first bird as well. It's still the orange that we put down earlier, but now I've added a light layer of burnt sienna to the top of it. To the throat of the bird, I'm now adding a second layer of Hansa yellow light. And I'll finish painting in the bird's head. His head is quite a bit lighter than the wings, so be sure that you're painting with a more watery mix. And with just a clean, damp tip of a brush, I blend these areas together. I let the colors mix on the paper, and be sure you don't overstroke these areas. While it's still damp, I add a slightly thicker consistency of paint of the same colors. I add more indigo to that mix to start painting the darkest darks I see, which are in the tail feathers of both of the birds. Again, I paint loosely around those orange markings that I painted earlier, and at this point they're completely dry. I let them poke out here and there. I follow the values I see in the photograph. The tail feather that's on the left is very dark, but on the right, they're quite a bit lighter. So I add more water and more burnt sienna to that feather. The shoulder of this wing is quite dark, so I pick up more indigo, add that to burnt sienna, and I come in and add brush strokes to darken those wings. The previous colors are still just slightly damp, so there's a soft diffusion between one color and the next. If you find that your colors are not diffusing softly, it's probably because that first layer is already dry. You can still take a damp brush and just soften the edge to create this a impression of a diffused color. And on that far wing, the bottom is much darker than the top. By painting that darker, it really gives us the impression that that wing is casting a shadow and is settled down up against the body. I found that the dark colors were starting to travel quite a bit into the orange breast of the bird. So here with a dry brush, I'm just drying that area, and also with a towel. I just dry the orange breast of the bird to stop that dark wing color from spreading too far into it. If you're painting along with me, it's likely that your bird and my bird will look very different at this stage. It's important that you make the brush strokes and the color adjustments that your bird needs and not just follow what I'm doing, because what I'm doing is because of what my bird needs. Your bird might not need a second layer of orange or yellow, or you might need to go darker still. Use your reference photo to help you determine what next steps to do on your bird. I want to let this first bird dry before I do any more details, so I move my attention to the second bird, and his tail feathers are really dark. So I pick up burnt sienna with indigo, painting around those orange markings at a pretty thick consistency, milk to creamy. Once I've used those orange markings to help me be accurate with the structure of his tail feathers, I can come in and hide some of them and play down the way they're standing out. They're standing out too much right now. I pick up burnt sienna, fairly watery, and soften the transition between the orange belly of the bird and the tail. I'm also looking at the photograph and seeing dark spots tucked in behind those flowers. With the same mixture that I used on the first bird, burnt sienna, indigo, and French ultramarine blue, I start painting in his head. When we paint the head, we want to be really careful to paint around the accurate shape of the eye and the beak. With birds, I have found that if you can be accurate with the proportions of the contour of the bird and accurate with his eye and beak, you can really go a little bit crazy with all the colors that you want to put within his body. He'll still read really believably as a bird. The common mistakes I see with bird paintings are making the eyes too big or the beaks too long. So just be sure as you paint along that that's not happening. That first layer is still damp, and I'm adding a thicker mixture of the same colors in those areas of the head where I see darker markings. And then with a clean, damp brush, and I mean just slightly damp, I start lifting out color and blending colors together as needed. When I talk about a damp brush, I really mean a brush that's been cleaned out in the water and then dried out on a towel. It's damp to the touch, but it's not really carrying water into your painting. That's the best consistency to have for softening edges. As I continue to add the dark markings across his face, I'm careful to pick up paint that is fairly thick. The thicker the paint I pick up on my brush, the less it'll travel, even if I'm painting it into a damp area. While I let the birds dry, I pick up that same thick consistency of mostly burnt sienna with just a touch of indigo and paint in the branch. Right now I'm just getting in the shape of the branch. I'll come in for a second round to add the shadows or lift out highlights. To add the details of the branch, I put down my medium brush and pick up my small brush. I pick up watery indigo and mix in burnt sienna. It's still a fairly dark hue, and I start painting in some of the darker shadowy details I want to add to the branch. At this point, the brown paint I put down is still damp, so these dark details blend softly into the brown. I rinse out my brush, dry it off, and then I use it to lift out a little highlight down the center of the branch. Because that branch is still damp, it's easy to lift out this highlight. And the color that is left will be soft edge against that highlight. I use the same technique all the way up the branch. Once I'm done with the branch, still using my small brush, I want to focus on getting the beak and eyes done. I want those to be fairly dark, so I mix up thick consistency of indigo with just a touch of burnt sienna in it. Be sure to spend time doing this accurately. I feel that often we speed through this part of it, and trying to fix that beak or that eye tends to make the beak bigger and bigger with every pass at it. And the eye just gets lost the more and more we stroke at it. So be deliberate and try to get the eyes and beaks done in as few strokes as possible. There is a small circle of skin around the eye, and that's what you see me here leaving as the white of the paper. Then there's the black part of the eye with a little highlight in it. Earlier we painted that whole area manganese blue. So now when I come in and paint the black around it, that manganese blue hue reads as a nice highlight that we're leaving showing through. You can see the bottom beak is much darker than the top beak, as the top beak is getting light reflected down on it from above. I apply the same technique to the second bird. As I add some of the markings around the eye, they're just too hard edge. It looks too much like caked on mascara. So again, with a soft, damp brush edge, I soften those dark marks I just painted. I stand back and take a look. Always give yourself time to assess where your painting is at and take a deep breath. Sometimes just walking away and coming back with fresh eyes 15 minutes later really helps as well. It's time to do our second pass on the flowers and leaves. Here we're going to add some darker colors. Not everywhere, just here and there, letting some of the lighter colors we painted earlier poke through. This definitely will give it more interest and more dimension. You can see that I'm still leaving my puddles of green separate. There's the sap green on top and then the green gold on the bottom part of my palette. And I go back and forth between the two. It's great if they mix on the paper, and I prefer that look instead of just mixing them into a homogeneous mixed sap green, green gold on my palette. Then all the leaves would look the same. But this way, I paint around and I make sure that every leaf is slightly different than the leaf that came before it. In addition to creating a variety in your greens by using different colors, I also think about the edges. We want a variety in some of the edges of these leaves. In some areas, those edges should be soft where they blend into another leaf or into a petal. And in some areas, we want the edges to be hard. If all the edges around our flowers and our leaves were hard edge, it would start to look like a very mechanical, scientific study. If they were all soft, we would lose the structure of what we're looking at and it would all start blending together. Good paintings have a good variety of hard edges and soft edges. Here I'm adding some watery yellow, and again using hard edges and soft edges in different areas. I just want a more spontaneous look. And at this point, speaking of spontaneity, I'm going to start splattering. I pick up my medium brush and I start off with that darker orangey hue that I use for those center dots in the flowers. That's quinacridone rose, Aussie red gold, and a little bit of quinacridone gold. I splatter gently and then I run a wet brush through a lot of those splatters. I also pick up with the slightly damp brush where those splatters might have inadvertently landed on the birds or flowers if I didn't want them there. Now I create splatters with the yellow. These splatters are a fun way of creating a light and interesting background without having to paint every square edge. The splatters can also give it a real spontaneous, lively look. If you're not comfortable with splatters or you haven't done them before, I definitely recommend practicing on a spare piece of paper. The paint has to be wet enough to release from the brush just by being hit on the brush, like you see me hitting my brush with my index finger. If the paint on my brush were too thick, it would not release. If it's too watery, on the other hand, as it dries, it might just disappear altogether. Here you see me adding manganese blue hue and splattering it and softening it. Now I'm coming in with sap green to re-emphasize some of those leaves. As you splatter, if it lands somewhere where you don't want, use a clean, wet brush to pick that splatter up. It's wet enough that it should come off pretty easily. I'm adding a lot more green around those flowers, which makes those flowers start to look more white. It's helping to define their edges. You can see me picking up splatters right off of the bird with a slightly damp brush. Be sure not to do it with a brush that's fully loaded with water. And here I have quinacridone rose. I'm coming in and splattering around a little bit of quinacridone rose on some of those petals. I feel that that pink just gives the whole branch a little pick-me-up. I soften some of those lines with a damp brush. That flower I'm working on now is just getting too dark, and in a few minutes you'll see me come back to it and lift out the color with a towel. Painting this watery seems scary sometimes, like you're out of control, but it actually gives you more time to figure out if you like what's going on or if it needs to be lifted out with a brush or a towel. I add a few splatters with quinacridone rose, and I think I'm done splattering. I want to go in and finish off the last few details. I pick up the dark orangey blend that I had painted earlier, and I had used that also for the details on some of the tail feathers. I use it here to damp down the white line that's between the top beak and the bottom beak, and also to color in that white circle around the eye, which actually in the photo shows up as quite orangey red. With the watery indigo, I add in the last few touches on the beaks. Once I'm done with these details, I put down my small brush, I pick up my medium brush, and with very watery quinacridone rose, I soften up some of those shapes that I've already painted. I blend them out into the background. These little blend outs of color really help connect the subject with the background. And with these last few strokes, I'm done with the painting part of this project. I need it to completely dry before I can come in and re-emphasize some of my pencil lines. Be sure the paper is completely dry before you come in with your pencil to re-emphasize some of your drawing. You may prefer not to do that, and you may in fact prefer to go in and erase out any pencil lines that show. But I really enjoyed adding a few pencil lines, not everywhere. I don't want to outline every shape like a cartoon. I really choose just a few areas, a few petals, the head and the back of the bird, some of the tail feathers. I feel like going back in with the pencil and restating some of the drawing adds to the spontaneous look of this watercolor. With the splashes, the pencil line, and our application of paint, I think this turned out to be quite a light, spontaneous looking watercolor. Thanks for joining me for this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it.